just go. See if this works on here. Okay. Good afternoon. I did a chapter with Xin Gu on Shanghai, but I was asked not to speak to my chapter, so I feel it's probably filed under Charles Landry, perhaps somewhere in the books. But anyway, that's up for you to judge. So I'm not really going to talk about the chapter on Shanghai, but I am going to start with Shanghai because basically our chapter on Shanghai grew out of a linkage project, and the linkage project was very much about creative clusters and how that as a sort of global policy concept moved into Shanghai. And our intention, it being a linkage project, was that we would work with companies here in Australia, notably Arab, and look at how contemporary design could be brought to enhance creative clusters in Shanghai, of which from about 2006 onwards, they went from 0 to 200 very, very quickly, 200 creative clusters, and they're having a second spurt now. So, we could help bring design to these clusters, and that's what we attempted to do. So it's clearly a case of policy transfer in some ways. It's like maybe a thicker notion of policy, but it's a policy transfer. And that's really what I want to reflect on, stressing the global and policy more than the cities, perhaps. But first, what we suggested in Shanghai, we went in and we said, look, design of clusters, creative clusters, has really advanced in the West, and that we could really help them with this. And we quickly realised two things. First of all, design travels very quickly, and it travelled much quicker than us. Because when we get there, there are some fantastically designed clusters all over China, especially in Shanghai, which is a global city. Some great, real high quality design there, of all sorts, all singing, all dancing, and it's expanding very quickly. But the second thing was that design in a deeper sense, we had a seminar about this last week, not so much the superficial aesthetic dimension of design, but the deeper sense of how do you construct something, how do you design something that's fit for purpose. This was much more troublesome because, in fact, this aspect of designing clusters had not travelled very well. But it wasn't because they were behind in some way. It's because actually the policy and the industry context was very, very different in Shanghai. The motives behind creative clusters, although often using the language that can be understood at any international level of enhancing creativity, using creativity to drive economic growth, urban regeneration, city image, etc., etc. There were different vectors behind it. Very quickly realised that we were talking about a different framework in place. And I suppose in a nutshell, the notion of culture, of art or aesthetics, and of economy that were supposed to be addressed by the creativity and the creative industries agenda were actually set within a very different framework. And it's understanding, that actually we can't quite use the way this international policy transfer language, if you like. We can't use it in a straightforward way. Now, some of the contradictions are fairly clear, I suppose. One classic one, for example, is how creative clusters excluded the vast majority of small creative businesses. And you would think, well, that's a bit silly, I mean, this is their primary objective in all the literature and all the policy statements was that it would bring together these small businesses. And this didn't really happen, or on a quite a minimal level. So it was clearly, we could say, oh, this is not working here, and if you're aiming to get there, you should be doing this. But these sort of arguments are not quite working. And I think what we're finding really is that these fundamental, the frameworks in which we're looking at are very Eurocentric, and I'll come back to that. Now, it could be put down to as it often is in China, a hangover from the communist heritage, if you like. I've lost my space now. A hangover from the communist heritage, where obviously state-driven development has worked. And you could also expand it to East Asia, where the Asian tigers use state-led development, protectionism in some ways, to drive their economies after the Second World War. But I think it's quite clear now, especially now that China is emerging as the second biggest global economy, that there's nothing interim about this. There's something structural, a new structuration of, I think, the economy and state, but also of structuration of culture. And I think it raises some huge issues about non-Euro modernities. And I use that term Euro modernities, I've nicked it from Larry Grossberg, where he talks about what we've called modernity is very clearly a European, North American kind of modernity. What about alternative modernities? What about different alternatives? What about multiple modernities? What would that mean for a policy transfer when there's no centre from which to transfer anything? And at this point, these sort of questions intersect with another dimension of what I've been doing recently, which is working with UNESCO. And it's something that only happened a year ago. I got appointed as, I don't know what the full title is, but a technical expert around policies for culture and development. And it's a program organised by UNESCO and the EU. And actually, it's through that I've came across Viraj's previous existence as UNESCO, and he wrote some of the real major reports that framed my understanding anyway around culture and development in the 1990s. And they really, a lot of what, as Raj said, a lot of where UNESCO's thinking was coming from was this idea of culture and development, the role of culture in development. And it's quite clearly within this framework that a lot of the new kind of cultural policy thinking began to develop in the 1990s. And I think there's two ways in which we could see culture relating to development. First of all, that in development, we couldn't just look at, technical economic activities, put that in place, put that in place, put that in place, and you will get development. There were clearly cultural dimensions in that larger sense of historical, cultural structures, identities, histories that needed to be addressed if culture was going to cut any ice in those particular countries. That it could be a drag or it could be a boon, depending on which way you approached it. I'm sure that's quite clear. But the second dimension of culture is something, again, that Raj talked about earlier, which is without the cultural dimension, development is soulless. It's the idea that we need that all-round cultural experience, and to address those cultural experiences, if development is to be anything other than seen as empty economic growth. It's not necessarily, it's not opposed to economic growth, but it sets a framework within which we understand growth as more than just about GDP, but about human dignity, quality of life, the full flowering of cultural expression. And this is where Sen and Stiglitz and the other sort of developmental economists are really beginning to talk about, questioning the emphasis on pure growth. So the question for me, and keeping those questions about China in the back of your head, how do the cultural and creative industries, how are they to be conceived in this notion of culture and development? And which again that particular question has its history within UNESCO, because the strong emphasis on culture and development that I've talked about in the early 2000s resulted in a very famous convention, a convention on cultural diversity, the protection of cultural diversity. I realise there's experts in this room know more about it than me. But it's where the idea was that certain dominant global forces, brackets the US, were sending all their cultural products and services out into the world, dominating the markets, moving into a much more global penetration of local markets, and we needed to protect about this. And culture, what began as really a French and maybe a French-Canadian inspired movement for cultural exceptionism, if you remember that, around the GATT talks and those things, where culture shouldn't just be seen as a matter of trade, it's a matter of culture, and therefore should not be subject to pure laws of international free trade. They sort of turned this around and called it the protection of cultural diversity, and this resulted in the 2005 convention, in which this was presented, we need to find ways of protecting our cultural goods and services. And I think this is, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's quite problematic. Essentially, from what sounded like a culture and development agenda, quickly moved sideways into developed countries protecting their existing cultural industries. For good and bad reasons, that's neither here nor there in this case, but that's what happened. And I think what's been happening recently, certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, is to bring back cultural and development onto the agenda, but we've now faced with the real issue of globalizing cultural and creative industries. So again, so how does the promotion of cultural and creative industries fit in with issues around cultural diversity and the cultural and development thesis? And I think that's what's facing a lot of us now talking about cultural policy. First of all, some of the problems with the cultural diversity approach was that it was very much about nations. You know, protecting our cultural goods and services against the bad US, usually, or a bit of the UK, Europe. It was really about nations defending themselves, defending their identities. Very much about nation states, in that, and led to a lot of exclusionary practices. And I think that the Chinese state, for all sorts of good and bad reasons, are struggling with it at the moment. They want creative industries, but they don't want Americans to come in and bring stuff with them. USA, of course, long practicing protectionism, but they're way ahead of the game on this one. Secondly, creativity is about new ideas. It's quite clear that the launch of the creative industries wave after 1998 had lots of resonances, not just in Europe and North America, but outside in developing countries. It was about new business communities. It was about the growth of urban centres. All those cities really, a lot of them really grasped the creative industries. It's about education, it's about new opportunities, it's about new ways of making a living, it's about new consumption opportunities outside official arts and culture, outside official state media. So there's some very powerful democratic, I think, current in there. We also know that creative industries is increasingly about the ownership and exploitation of IPR rights, a whole range of IPR, not just copyright, a whole range of them, and that these are increasingly organised by global companies in the developed West, and globalization of creative industries leads it leads almost inevitably to greater polarization. The developed world basically do well out of it, and the underdeveloped world does less well out of it. And so, in fact, IPR rights, global IPR rights, actually, in some ways, result in a destruction of cultural diversity and global polarization. And creative cities themselves, as we've seen in some of those chapters, often about opening up local cultures and economies to cosmopolitan trends. My chapter about Shanghai is very much about that. But it's also where a point of intersection where IPR-driven creative companies, global creative companies, find a route in a local markets. It's what Akbar Abbas in his fantastic essay on Hong Kong called arbitrage, where these small creative businesses, which look like the explosion of creativity, in fact what they're doing is working to link large global companies to local markets. So what I'm trying to say, there's some positives and negatives going on at the moment that really need to be looked at carefully. A set of real conflicts. You know, there's a universalist vision of agencies such as UNESCO for culture and development, linked to human rights, but also an extension of the creative economy that opens up possibilities, but also brings some real problems with it. And it sort of takes me back to where I started, I hope, where concepts of economics, concepts of culture, are clearly under stress. The way we understand them in our Euro-modernity, they're still really under stress. And as we go into more development, as the global creative industries extend, the lines between them get very blurred. So what I'd just concluded with a few points, which is, I think the cultural policies, cultural politics even, of the 1970s left, the left-wing cultural policy, and cultural policy was, in that sense, mostly left-wing. I think it's in a state of real confusion. I think it no longer actually knows how to deal with this culture economy thing. And it leaves the field open to a very neoliberal version of the creative industries, which is effectively pushing it to the margins. And so I think we need to look at two things, really. I think we need, without sounding too fancy, a cultural economy of the cultural economy. So cultural economy is about, as emerging discipline, it's about how markets are constructed, not as some eternal economic law, but culturally. How does that now work around cultural economics, and how does the line between culture and economics, how is that drawn in different places? Because, of course, one claim of the 1970s cultural policy was that the rise of culture, the rise of the creative industries, cultural industries, creative industries, would lead to a culturalization of the economy, which meant certainly this was a new economic sector that had to be taken seriously, etc., but it also meant that elements of the economy would become more cultural and somehow subject to the values embedded in culture. And I don't think that's happened. I don't think it's happened, and I think that much of the cultural policy world has no answer to the way in which that agenda has been pushed to one side. We've now got an economic agenda for culture. And I don't think an economic agenda for culture, as driven by creative and cultural industries, works with the culture and development agenda, as I outlined earlier. So we've got real conflict going on. But I think, finally, the GFC and questions around global warming, I would say they do more to question the nature of what economics is than cultural policy has in recent years. And I think these questions around what is economic, what is economically rational, have got to be addressed by cultural policy in quite more, I would say, in a more aggressive way, in a much, not just culture is economically important, please support us, but actually culture has things to say that suggest that the economic elements, certain aspects of the way the economy is constructed, is dysfunctional. So I think we're moving away from a globalizing cultural policy with, essentializing nation states and their cultural identities. We're in a much more fluid, volatile, complex situation. But I think to address that can no longer be done under the sign of creative industries or creative cities. And I think we need a new sign to deal with it. Okay?